Imagine the scene for a moment. It is just past midnight in Tehran. The ceasefire has been extended and the outside world is trying to exhale. Then, almost in the same breath, Iranian state television fills the screen with a very different image. A ballistic missile standing in the middle of the capital, floodlit, framed, and surrounded by a chanting crowd. That is the image that matters tonight. Not because it is loud, but because it is precise. In strategic communication, some messages are delivered through communiques, some through diplomatic language, and some through steel, fuel, and staging. According to the sequence described in the transcript, this happened during the night from the 21st to the 22nd of April, 2026. As the ceasefire between Iran and the United States was officially approaching its end, and as Donald Trump announced an extension of that truce, the Iranian system answered not with conciliatory symbolism, but with a public demonstration of force. Iranian state broadcaster IRGC reportedly aired live images from Enghelab Square, the Revolution Square in Tehran. There, a dense crowd gathered around a large ballistic missile mounted on a mobile launcher, illuminated from every angle and presented as the centerpiece of the night. Similar scenes, according to the same account, were repeated in other cities, including Iraq. The crowd was not celebrating peace. That distinction matters. The slogans were anti-American and anti-Israeli. The flags were national, and the choreography was unmistakably political. Nothing about that kind of staging is accidental. Not the location, not the timing, not the choice of weapon, and not the decision to broadcast it in prime time. When a state places one of its most symbolically important missiles in the middle of a capital city on the very night a truce is extended, it is not improvising, it is communicating. So let me walk you through the core of that message, because the missile itself is central to understanding the event. The weapon identified in the transcript is the Khorramshahr-4, described there as one of the most advanced ballistic missiles in Iran's arsenal. If that identification is correct, then Tehran was not displaying a peripheral system, a disposable rocket, or a lower-tier deterrent. It chose a strategic symbol. That choice is the first layer of the story, and the second layer is the name itself. Khorramshahr is not just a technical designation. It is a city whose name is deeply embedded in Iran's war memory, especially in relation to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. In Iranian political language, Khorramshahr evokes endurance, sacrifice, destruction, survived, and eventual resistance. So when that name appears on a missile, it is already doing more than identifying hardware. It is linking a modern weapon system to a historical narrative of national defiance. In other words, the weapon is not only military, it is psychological, ideological, and domestic. The transcript describes the Khorramshahr-4 as having an officially announced range of roughly 2,000 kilometers. In practical terms, that means Israel lies within reach from Iranian territory. Some Western analysts, as the transcript notes, have also suggested that the real envelope could be greater, potentially extending toward 4,000 kilometers under certain assumptions. If that estimate were accurate, the strategic conversation changes immediately. The issue would no longer be confined to Iran and its immediate neighborhood. It would touch a much wider geography, including parts of Europe, and would raise questions not only about deterrence, but about layered missile defense and escalation management. The transcript also states that the missile can carry multiple warheads and that in one of its more advanced reported configurations, it can move at around Mach 8 in the atmosphere. Whether every public claim around this system is fully verified is a separate technical question, but that is not the point of the parade. The point of the parade is that Iran wanted the audience to think in those terms. Range, speed, survivability, strategic reach. The state did not need to launch the missile for the image to work. It only needed to make the public, its adversaries and its negotiators look at it and remember what it represents. Now we come to the timing, and this is where the event becomes more than spectacle. Why that night? Why the very moment a ceasefire was being extended? The transcript gives one plausible answer. Trump, in explaining the extension of the truce, reportedly framed Iran as fractured, divided, and unable to produce a coherent, unified proposal. That framing matters because it presents the Iranian regime not as dangerous and disciplined, but as weak and disorganized. For Tehran, that kind of description is not merely insulting, it is strategically corrosive. A system that depends heavily on deterrence cannot allow the image of internal disarray to become the dominant external narrative, especially not during a military standoff, and especially not while negotiations remain fragile. So Iran appears to have responded the way revolutionary states often do when they feel both pressured and narrated by others. It answered with a picture designed to overwrite the previous one, not a divided regime, but a disciplined one, not a system on its knees, but one still capable of projecting force in full public view. That is why one image can matter more than 10 speeches. A missile in the street says, without an official statement, that the state still controls the stage. It says the chain of command still exists, the arsenal still exists, and the capacity for retaliation still exists. But there is a second audience here, and in some ways it may be the more important one. This display was not aimed only at Washington. It was aimed inward, at the Iranian public itself. After weeks of bombardment, blockade, pressure, economic humiliation, and the emotional fatigue that comes with prolonged crisis, regimes like this face a domestic imperative. They must convince their own population and perhaps their own elite factions that endurance still has meaning. They must show that pain has not translated into surrender. That is where the domestic logic of the parade becomes clear. The state needed a visible argument. It needed to show that resistance remained organized, that the infrastructure of power remained intact, and that the symbols of retaliation had not disappeared under pressure. The transcript adds another crucial detail. The date coincided with the eve of the anniversary of the founding of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, marked on the 22nd of April. If so, then the symbolism becomes even sharper. You do not display a premier ballistic missile in your capital on the eve of a Revolutionary Guard anniversary by coincidence. That is not random pageantry. It is institutional signaling. It tells the Iranian public that the Guards remain central, relevant, and unbowed. And it tells foreign observers that any negotiation with Iran still unfolds under the shadow of the security apparatus, not outside it. This is an important distinction because ceasefires are never experienced equally inside states with competing power centers. Diplomats may talk in one register, military institutions may talk in another, political leaders may search for room to maneuver, while security organs seek to preserve deterrence credibility at all costs. That tension is visible here. If the diplomats are trying to preserve a channel, the missile parade is a reminder that another logic remains fully active. It is the logic of coercive signaling, where restraint is temporary and visible force is part of the bargaining position. Now consider what this means for the negotiations themselves. According to the transcript, one of Washington's central demands has been that Iran renounce, limit, or place under supervision its ballistic missile program. That is not a side issue. It is one of the most sensitive and structurally difficult parts of any possible understanding. For the United States, Iran's missile program is not merely a military question. It is a proliferation question, a regional stability question, and a force protection question. Ballistic missiles are the backbone of Tehran's ability to threaten adversaries without needing air superiority. They are also one of the few instruments through which Iran can impose costs asymmetrically. For Iran, The exact same program is seen in almost the opposite way. It is not a bargaining chip in the ordinary sense. It is a strategic insurance policy, a substitute for vulnerabilities elsewhere, and a deterrent architecture built over years of sanctions and isolation. And that is why this public display lands with such force on the very night when talks are supposed to remain alive. Tehran reportedly places the very class of weapon Washington wants, constrained, at the center of a national stage. It is difficult to imagine a clearer nonverbal response, and the message, stripped of theater, is simple. This program is not negotiable on your terms. Tehran may negotiate timing, rhetoric, sequencing, or verification formats in other areas. But when it comes to the missile core of its deterrent posture, the regime appears determined to signal that capitulation is off the table. For American negotiators, that kind of signal is deeply problematic. It narrows political space in Washington, weakens advocates of compromise, and gives hardliners a clean visual argument that Tehran is acting in bad faith. A missile on parade is not just a domestic spectacle. It becomes evidence in the next round of political combat. And this is where the deeper damage may lie. Negotiations are not sustained by trust in the sentimental sense. They are sustained by workable assumptions about the other side's incentives, discipline, and willingness to preserve ambiguity when necessary. Publicly staging a strategic missile during a ceasefire extension cuts against that logic. It tells the other side that deterrence theater is still being prioritized over diplomatic reassurance. It suggests that Tehran is willing to preserve confrontation optics even when talks need oxygen. That does not automatically end a negotiation, but it does make every next step heavier. The transcript mentions Islamabad and describes the negotiations there as being in total deadlock. Whether one accepts that full characterization or not, the underlying point is sound. This kind of demonstration complicates diplomacy at the exact moment when both sides would need flexibility, plausible deniability, and face-saving formulas. A ceasefire, after all, is not peace. It is a pause suspended over unresolved disputes. If one side uses the pause to make a public statement of uncompromised military intent, then the pause starts to look less like de-escalation and more like repositioning. Stay with me here, because there is another layer that should not be missed. The parade is also a statement about hierarchy inside the Iranian system. It tells us something about who must be satisfied before any deal can survive. When a regime under pressure chooses to elevate a ballistic missile rather than a diplomat, it is revealing its own order of importance. The visible center of gravity is not reconciliation, it is deterrence and credibility. In practical terms, that means any negotiation that threatens the missile program too directly may collide not only with policy preferences, but with regime identity itself. That matters because outside observers often treat missile issues as technical files. They are not. In Iran's case, they sit at the intersection of military necessity, institutional pride, revolutionary legitimacy, and historical memory. You cannot separate the missile from the story the regime tells about why it exists. And this is why the image from Tehran feels colder than a speech. Speeches can be revised, they can be softened, denied, or explained away. A missile physically displayed under floodlights in the middle of the capital is harder to reinterpret. It also carries an unmistakable deterrent logic. The state is not saying, trust us. It is saying, remember what we can still do. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction may define the next phase of this crisis. A government betting on diplomacy tries to reduce fear. A government betting on deterrence tries to manage fear, shape it, and direct it. The latter does not need to calm the room. It needs the room to calculate. Seen from that angle, the parade is not irrational. It is coherent, even if dangerous. Tehran may believe that showing weakness invites pressure, while showing resolve, preserves room for maneuver. In that strategic culture, the missile in the street is not a contradiction of diplomacy. It is leverage before diplomacy. But leverage cuts both ways. What strengthens resolve at home may harden demands abroad. What restores regime prestige domestically may narrow options for compromise internationally. That is the trap built into coercive signaling. There's also the broader regional audience to consider. Israel does not watch that image as theater. Gulf states do not watch it as theater. European security planners do not watch it as theater. Every actor maps such displays onto range, circles, interception timelines, escalation ladders, and domestic politics of their own. So the consequences of one parade are larger than one night of television. It enters military assessments, alliance discussions, sanctions debates, and public narratives in capitals far beyond Tehran. It becomes part of the file. Now, let me be clear about something important. A public display of a missile does not by itself prove immediate intent to use it. States parade weapons for reasons of deterrence, propaganda, morale, and bargaining all the time. The significance lies not in assuming instant war, but in understanding what strategic atmosphere the display is designed to create. And the atmosphere here is one of controlled intimidation. Iran is saying that a ceasefire does not equal compliance, that a negotiation does not equal concession, and that an extension of calm does not mean the regime has accepted the terms under which that calm was granted. This is not merely a military story, it is also a story about political survival. Regimes under pressure often fear the optics of passivity more than the costs of provocation. If that is the case here, then the parade was less about changing the battlefield in one night and more about preventing the perception of strategic humiliation. And that helps explain the emotional temperature of the event. So the slogans, the lighting, the public crowd, the synchronized displays in multiple cities, and the state media coverage all point toward a carefully designed act of reassurance through defiance. The regime was telling its people, we remain standing, and the machinery of retaliation remains with us. But here is the unasked question. What if that same need for reassurance reveals insecurity rather than confidence? What if the parade is not only strength projected outward, but anxiety managed inward? That is the ambiguity at the heart of every authoritarian show of force. It can be read as a sign of confidence because the state dares to display power openly. It can also be read as a sign of pressure because the state feels compelled to prove repeatedly and theatrically that it still possesses power. The answer may be that it is both. Strategic behavior is often mixed. A regime can feel vulnerable and still act aggressively. It can fear erosion at home while remaining genuinely capable abroad. In fact, those conditions often reinforce one another. So that is why reducing this image to either triumph or panic would miss the deeper mechanisms. The real story is that Iran appears to be using deterrence display to manage several fronts at once. Washington, its own public, its own elite institutions, and the wider region. And the United States now faces a familiar dilemma. Does Washington interpret this as a reason to escalate demands, arguing that Tehran only responds to pressure? Or does it absorb the provocation, preserve the channel, and try to prevent symbolic confrontation from collapsing the negotiation entirely? Neither path is cost-free. Hardening demands may satisfy political instincts in the short term, but it can also lock both sides into positions from which climbing down becomes domestically impossible. Ignoring the display may preserve talks, but it risks signaling tolerance for exactly the kind of coercive theater Washington says it wants to stop. That is the real significance of this moment. The missile in the street is not just a message from Iran. It is a test of interpretation for everyone else, for Trump. If we follow the framing in the transcript, the challenge is immediate. He extended the ceasefire while portraying Iran as fragmented and unable to act cohesively. Iran's answer, at least visually, was to project the opposite: cohesion, readiness, and strategic continuity. If he responds by tightening terms, the display may have succeeded in provoking exactly the confrontation Tehran can use to justify further hardline positioning. If he chooses to downplay it in order to save negotiations, he may face criticism for overlooking a deliberate public challenge. For negotiators, the problem is even more structural. You cannot easily separate ballistic missiles from the wider bargaining environment because the missile program sits near the center of Iran's deterrent model. Asking Tehran to dismantle or sharply constrain it is not like asking for a marginal adjustment. And it strikes at one of the regime's core strategic beliefs, and that does not mean diplomacy is impossible. It means diplomacy, if it exists at all, will likely have to move through indirect formulas, sequencing, confidence building, and areas where both sides can claim partial success without forcing a visible surrender. Public humiliation and strategic symbolism usually move in the opposite direction. And that brings us back to the image from Tehran. In one sense, it was simple: a missile, a crowd, slogans, cameras. In another sense, it was a compact, strategic document carrying several messages at once. To Washington, it said that pressure has not erased deterrence. To the Iranian public, it said that the regime remains armed and organized. To the Revolutionary Guard, it said that its status remains central on the eve of its anniversary. And to the region, it said that the ballistic missile question remains unresolved, perhaps more than ever. So this is why the event should not be dismissed as mere propaganda. Propaganda is often treated as noise, but in moments like this, it is operational, political communication. It tells us how the state wants to frame the next phase of the confrontation. It also tells us what Tehran fears losing. States display what they believe must remain visible. In this case, what had to remain visible was not moderation, not fatigue, and not compromise. It was retaliatory capability. So where does that leave the ceasefire? In a fragile place. A ceasefire can survive mutual suspicion, but it struggles when both sides need public narratives that pull in opposite directions. One side wants to present the other as weakened. The other side answers by putting a strategic missile in the capital and daring everyone to call it weak. That is a combustible formula. It does not guarantee collapse, but it leaves very little room for error. One misread signal, one domestic overreaction, one retaliatory step, justified as restoring credibility, and the pause can start to unravel. In the end, the image from Tehran reveals something essential. In Iran, the ceasefire is not being performed as reconciliation. It is being performed as temporary restraint under arms. That is a very different posture. It means diplomacy exists, but under guard. It means talks may continue, but inside an environment where military symbolism still sets the emotional terms. And it means the ballistic missile issue is not peripheral to this crisis. It is one of its hard cores. So the final question is not whether the parade looked dramatic. It did. The final question is what strategic choice it signals. Was Iran showing that it still believes negotiation can coexist with deterrence so long as deterrence remains visibly intact? Or was it showing that when forced to choose between diplomatic flexibility and deterrent identity will win every time? The next hours and days matter because they will tell us how that image is read on the other side. If Washington treats it as an intolerable provocation, the negotiating space contracts sharply. If it treats it as expected theater in a coercive environment, the talks may survive, though on thinner ice than before. Either way, the message from that night was unmistakable. While the world was looking for proof that the truce had created breathing room, Tehran chose to display proof that its strike capacity remained part of the conversation. Not hidden, not implied, but standing in the open, under lights, before cameras, and before a crowd. And that may be the coldest part of the entire scene. On a night when diplomacy needed silence, Iran chose visibility. On a night when de-escalation needed ambiguity, Iran chose a ballistic missile. And on a night when the ceasefire was extended, the most memorable image was not peace, but deterrence on public display.